In the vast tapestry of 19th-century Latin American history, where former European colonies take their first steps as independent countries, one nation rises almost as an anomaly. A monarchy in the midst of a region filled with presidential republics. This is the case of the Empire of Brazil, which directly preceded the current Federative Republic of Brazil. For 67 years, the Empire of Brazil existed with a mixture of tradition and progress, leaving an indelible mark on the destiny of South America. From its birth in 1822 until its dissolution in 1889, the Empire of Brazil experienced an era of profound transformations, conflicts, and a constant effort to forge a national identity. Join us to learn in detail about the trajectory of this South American monarchical giant, unique in its kind, from its origins to its historical course and its outcome. My name is Alejandro Andrade, and this is the New Encyclopedia. And before we start with today's story, I want to invite you to support our channel. If you like our content, subscribe, give this video a like, turn on the notification bell, and share it with those who enjoy learning about history. I also invite you to follow us on Instagram, where we share exclusive content and previews of new documentaries. And finally, you can leave us your opinions and thoughts in the comments section. We always read your comments and take your suggestions into account for future research. And now, without further ado, let's begin today's story. Before 1822, Brazil was a Portuguese colony before becoming an empire. The Portuguese colonization of Brazil began in the year 1500, with the arrival of the explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral, who claimed the newly discovered territory for Portugal, in accordance with the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494. Initially, the Portuguese crown divided the territory into hereditary captaincies granted to Portuguese nobles to encourage colonization and economic development, mainly based on sugar production, with slave labor, both African and indigenous, and also with the extraction of the so-called Brazil wood, a type of native tree with very strong wood, whose trade gave the territory of Brazil its name. However, in 1549, to improve administration, Portugal established a general government with its capital in Salvador de Bahia, on the central coast of the territory, thus consolidating control over the colony. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the colony of Brazil expanded its borders inland, developing livestock farming and mining, and maintaining an economy based on agricultural plantations and the exploitation of a wide variety of natural resources. Brazil, during Portuguese colonial rule, received from its metropolis all the necessary elements for the emergence of its own national consciousness, along with a series of administrative prerogatives that gradually granted it more autonomy in its internal affairs. So that by the beginning of the 19th century, Brazil was not actually so different from continental Portugal. And this fact would be decisive in a key event, which is the arrival of the Portuguese royal family in the colony of Brazil in 1808. In the context of the Napoleonic Wars, and with neighboring Spain occupied by Napoleon Bonaparte, it was feared that his next target would be Portugal. The Portuguese royal family, led at that time by King João VI, decided to flee to Brazil to avoid the same fate as the Spanish king, Ferdinand VI or Sixtern. He had been captured and forced to abdicate the throne of Spain to Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. The arrival of the Portuguese royal family in Rio de Janeiro had a strong impact on the colony of Brazil, as the royal family and the court elevated the political and economic status of the colony, which in the year 1815 became known as the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarve. This change led to greater administrative and institutional autonomy, which would be felt throughout the territory in the years to come, and, above all, by the Brazilian noble families and also the Portuguese families already settled in Brazil, After the Napoleonic Wars ended, King João VI and the Cortes, pressured by various sectors in Portugal, decided to return to the metropolis in 1821. However, King João VI leaves his son Pedro as Prince Regent of Brazil at the time of these events, raised to the status of a kingdom. Problems will arise when the courts in Portugal try to revoke the autonomy granted to Brazil in 1815, to which the local elites react unfavorably. Nevertheless, a unique figure joins the Brazilian local elites in their resistance against the Portuguese metropolis. It was Prince Pedro, who formally refused on January 9, 1822, the request from the Portuguese courts to return to Portugal. This was seen as a significant event that indicated the new direction Brazil was taking. Prince Pedro, for reasons that deserve a separate video, joins the now clamorous independence movement of the local Brazilian elite. Thus, between September 6 and 7, 1822, Pedro makes a proclamation on the banks of the Ipiranga River, the proclamation of Brazil's independence, which ends with the historic cry of independence or death. To formalize what already existed in practice, Prince Pedro is crowned as Pedro the Fern of Brazil by ecclesiastical authorities and important members of the local elites on October 12 of that year. 1822 definitively separating Portugal from Brazil, which takes the name Empire of Brazil and adopts the constitutional monarchy as its form of government. Thus, between 1822 and 1824, the so-called War of Independence of Brazil took place, which was much less violent than the wars of independence of the former Spanish colonies surrounding the territory of Brazil. With no significant human or material losses to regret, it ends with Portugal's recognition of the Empire of Brazil and its monarch, Pedro I, on August 29, 1825. Thus somewhat enlightened and civilized, Brazil was established as an independent nation, a faithful and legitimate heir to the Portuguese monarchical tradition, from which it also inherits that desire to expand and consolidate itself as a true empire on the South American continent. The early years of the young empire were cut short by some difficulties. Although Pedro thus assumes the title of emperor, seeking to emphasize the diversity of the Brazilian provinces and emulate Napoleonic modernity, he soon sets aside his liberal ideals. The Constitution of 1824 grants him considerable power, which at that time was seen as necessary to maintain control over the vast interior regions, especially those in the north of the country. However, this concentration of power by Pedro III fuels a growing Republican sentiment in numerous provinces, supported by various sectors that turn against the monarch. On the other hand, one of the most significant challenges of the early years of the empire is the so-called Cisplatin War. In 1825, an independence revolution breaks out in the so-called Eastern Province, which included the current territory of Uruguay. This territory had been annexed by Portugal and later joined to Brazil in 1821. The province not only declares its independence from Brazil, but also its desire to join the other Rio de la Plata provinces. This triggered in December of that year, 1825, the war against the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, today known as the Argentine Republic. Meanwhile, Pedro I's popularity within Brazil is declining. Because of his involvement in illegal businesses to obtain money in his public relationship with his lover, Domitila de Castro Quento e Melo, whom he grants the title of Marquess. His indecision between the interests of Brazil and his family loyalty to Portugal, where his father, João VI, still reigned, and over whose throne Pedro himself still held succession rights. Do they make the situation worse? Finally, following a political crisis, Uruguay's loss in the Cisplatin War, and a chronic fiscal deficit in Portugal. Pedro I decided to abdicate the throne of Brazil on April 7, 1831, in favor of his 5-year-old son, Prince Pedro de Alcântara. His departure to Portugal marks the beginning of a new stage for the young empire. With the abdication of Pedro the Archers, Brazil enters a period of regency, that is, a stage in which the monarch cannot perform his duties. Another royal family member takes power in his place. However, in the case of Brazil, the regency was carried out not by members of the family, but by several civilians who were members of parliament. That's why this period is known as the Republican experience. Following Pedro I's abdication, the provincial triple regency was set up that same day, with representatives from the 3 political branches of the country, liberals, conservatives, and the military, branches that had emerged from the development of Brazilian politics. The liberals, who were members of the urban bourgeoisie, merchants, and journalists, sought greater autonomy for the provinces, and they advocated for strengthening the parliament in relation to the monarch, whom they still regarded as sovereign, however. On the other hand, the conservatives, who were members of the old rural aristocracy, ranchers and landowners, were firmly in favor of centralizing power in the figure of a single monarch. And finally, the military, who at that time did not have a fixed political position, favored liberals or conservatives according to their interests at the moment, serving as a kind of counterbalance. But going back to the provincial regency, it was in charge of organizing the elections for the so-called permanent triumvirate regency, which was established on June 17, 1831, and was composed of the liberal politicians João Braulio Muniz and José Costa Carvalho, and the military man Francisco de Lima y Silva. Later, the priest and liberal politician Diogo Feijó gained enough influence in the circles of Brazilian power, and in 1834, he made it so that the so-called Additional Act was created, with which the triumvirate regency became a single regency, that is, with only one region. After this, Feijó was elected sole regent through indirect elections in Parliament and took office on October 12, 1835. His administration is considered democratic, since he created provincial legislative assemblies to grant greater autonomy to the provinces and gave Rio de Janeiro the status of a neutral municipality. However, his inability to control popular uprisings, such as the so-called War of the Farrapos, and his unpopularity for not implementing the reforms promised to liberal leaders, led him to resign on September 12, 1837. After these events, Pedro de Araújo Lima, Marquis of Olinda, assumed the position of sole regent on that same day, also facing during his regency the so-called Farroupilha rebellion. In his attempts to combat it, Araújo Lima repealed the rights of the provincial assemblies, which paradoxically sparked 2 new uprisings: the Sabinada in Bahia between November 1837 and March 1838, and the Balaiada in Pernambuco further worsened the already precarious situation of the Regency. The almost anarchic political instability that reigns during this period of Regency leads the liberal elements to put pressure on Parliament to force Araújo Lima's resignation, a goal they achieve in June 1840. Meanwhile, Parliament ends the Regency, declaring that Prince Pedro de Alcântara was already of age, even though he was actually only 14 and a half years old at that time. In this way, Pedro de Alcântara is declared of age on July 23, 1840, automatically assuming the throne of the Empire of Brazil as Pedro II. Although his coronation as such will take place the following year, on July 18, 1841, at the age of 15. The rise of Pedro II marks the beginning of the so-called Second Reign, a period of profound transformation in all dimensions of Brazil, and, for many, the height of the Brazilian Empire par excellence. Despite having inherited an empire on the verge of disintegration, we will see how Pedro II will transform it in the coming years into an emerging international power. The figure of Pedro II is central to understanding the rise of the Empire of Brazil. Born in 1825 and having a complex childhood, when he reached physical and mental maturity in 1846, Pedro II underwent a remarkable transformation. He became a man of imposing physical presence, standing 1.93 meters tall with blonde hair and blue eyes. His initial weaknesses, typical of early adolescence, disappeared, giving way to remarkable qualities such as impartiality, dedication, courtesy, patience, and good sense. Realizing he is emperor, he fully asserts his authority. His social skills and dedication to government greatly contribute to projecting a public image of efficiency. The historian Roderick Barman describes him in his works as someone who kept his emotions under strict discipline. He was never rude and never lost his head. He was exceptionally intelligent with words and cautious in the way he reacted. Pedro II saw his role as that of an arbiter who set aside his personal ideas so as not to affect his duty to moderate political disputes between the parties. Dedicated, he conducts daily inspections and personally visits public administration offices, impressing his subjects with his overwhelming confidence. His reserved nature and concise way of speaking make conversations with him a bit difficult, but it does not hinder his management as a sovereign. When Pedro II assumes power, the Brazilian political system, although inspired by British parliamentarism, works in a reversed way, being known as reverse parliamentarism. Because unlike in England, in Brazil the emperor had more power than the parliament. That's how, in 1847, Pedro II created the Council of Ministers and the position of President of the Council of Ministers, also known as Prime Minister, who would be responsible for organizing the government cabinet. With this reform, the emperor is limited to appointing the president of the council, who is responsible for appointing the other ministers. This allows the emperor to avoid political wear and tear without diminishing his authority. Thus, from 1850 onwards, political and economic stability becomes the hallmark of Pedro II's reign. He, in turn, manages to build an efficient machinery of government based on the exchange of favors with the agrarian elites who held the economic power in 19th century Brazil. In exchange for the political stability necessary for the country's prosperity, the emperor grants favors, such as the construction of railways, artificial lakes, noble titles, and the acquisition of machinery to members of these elites. In this way, in the early years of his government, Pedro II forges a stable and prosperous country. Meanwhile, in the politics of the historical parties, the liberal and the conservative are pleased with the emperor's work. For his part, the emperor builds his popularity through direct contact with the people. Throughout his reign, Pedro II holds public audiences on Tuesdays and Saturdays, where anyone, including slaves, is received and can present their petitions to the monarch. In turn, Pedro visits schools, prisons, exhibitions, factories, and barracks, taking advantage of these public appearances to gather first-hand information about the state of the country. Although, in any case, Pedro already knew what he needed to know since Brazil enjoyed internal stability and economic prosperity. At that time, the country, greatly benefited by the Second Industrial Revolution, was being connected from end to end with railways, telegraph lines, and steamships, becoming a unified entity, like very few in the region. Public opinion, both national and foreign, attributes these inventions, beginnings, and achievements to the Brazilian monarchy and to the personality of Pedro II. However, on the other hand, Aspects such as slavery, which was still legal, continued to be a stain on the Brazilian social fabric. No social institution had survived as long in Brazil as slavery. Rooted since the early decades of colonization and prolonged during the empire, it persisted throughout the Brazilian independence process. The maintenance of the slave system as an economic foundation inherited from Portugal was a fundamental concern, influencing the adoption of the imperial regime, in contrast to the Hispanic American Republican regime. Pedro II considered slavery a national disgrace, and he himself did not own slaves. His first public gesture against slavery occurred in 1850 when he threatened to abdicate if Parliament did not declare the Atlantic slave trade illegal. Although the Constitution did not grant him the power to intervene directly and put an end to the practice, he used his influence to persuade and gain political support for this request, which was finally ratified that same year. In turn, at the end of the 1860s, he addressed the issue of the slavery of children born to enslaved parents, publicly proposing the gradual eradication of slavery. In his throne speech in 1867, he received strong criticism, with some calling his decision national suicide. Finally, the so-called Free Womb Law was enacted on September 28, 1871, declaring free all children born to enslaved women from that date onward. Another important law was the so-called Sexagenarian Law of 1885, which granted freedom to slaves over 60 years old, although with the obligation to continue serving their owners for 3 more years, or until they turned 65. This event has been considered as the virtual destruction of the slave market in Brazil at that time. In this way, social tensions throughout Brazil increase as the abolitionist movement grows. Especially the coffee-growing southeast of Brazil, historically a stronghold of slavery, becomes a nerve center of rebellions, protests, and political and social struggles that lead to the final abolition of slavery. On May 13, 1888, with the signing of the so-called Lei Áurea. So one of the greatest historical aspirations of broad sectors of the population, such as the abolition of slavery, had been achieved during the reign of Pedro II. However, if there is a series of remarkable facts about the Empire of Brazil and the reign of Pedro II, it is the foreign policy and the Brazilian territorial expansion during those years. Brazil, at the time of these events with Pedro II, is the most powerful nation, both militarily and economically, in the entire South American continent. Therefore, by virtue of this, Pedro II's Brazil will use its vast resources to expand its borders and to seek influence in the politics of its neighboring countries. Thus, the foreign policy of the empire under Pedro II prioritizes avoiding at all costs the strengthening of the Rio de la Plata republics, that is, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, seeking absolute hegemony in the Rio de la Plata basin by blocking or controlling river routes and ports as it sees fit. In turn, Brazil intervenes both politically and militarily in neighboring countries whenever it considers it to be of strategic importance. An early incident that tested Brazil's determination was the so-called Christie Affair between 1862 and 1865. It happened that the British consul William Dougal Christie provoked a diplomatic crisis. He demanded compensation for the wreck of an English ship that was looted in the Brazilian region of Rio Grande do Sul and for the arrest of drunken British officers in Rio de Janeiro. The Brazilian government refuses to give in, and Christie orders British warships to seize Brazilian merchant ships as compensation. Pedro II personally leads the resistance, rejecting any concessions and ordering the Brazilian Navy to prepare for conflict, with ironclad ships and coastal defenses authorized to open fire. Pedro II's resolve surprises Christie, who suggests international arbitration to settle the conflict. King Leopold the Reign of Belgium, the arbitrator of the dispute, rules in favor of Brazil. After the British refused to apologize for the incident, Brazil cut diplomatic ties with him in June 1863. Finally, the United Kingdom offered a formal apology in 1865. This diplomatic victory greatly strengthens Brazil's image abroad and increases its international prestige as the South American hegemon. On the other hand, so-called Brazilian expansionism also manifests itself in the Amazon rainforest, of which several nations own several square kilometers. Colombia and Peru are the main countries to lose territorial integrity to the Empire of Brazil during these years. This was mainly due to the sparse population of the areas near Brazil and the gradual colonization by Brazilians who denied the principle of uti possidetis, to occupy unexplored territories. However, the most significant conflict for the Empire of Brazil, which highlights the expansionist stance in the foreign policy of that nation, it is the so-called War of the Triple Alliance from 1864 to 1870. We have an interesting video about this bloody conflict on our channel, which we invite you to watch to understand the background, development, and outcome of that war. The War of the Triple Alliance started from territorial and geopolitical disputes between Paraguay and Brazil and Argentina. The rise of the military leader Francisco Solano Lopez as president of Paraguay led him to pursue the economic growth of his nation. This disrupted the interests of Brazil and Argentina, nations historically used to taking advantage of Paraguay's economic and demographic weakness to assert themselves over it. However, the conflict did not break out in Paraguay, Brazil, or Argentina, but in Uruguay. In Uruguay, another territory coveted by Brazil since its loss in 1828, Bernardo Prudencio Barro of the White Party was in power. Barro was a close ally of the Paraguayan Solano Lopez. However, in 1863, former President Venancio Flores of the Colorado Party, supported for geopolitical reasons by both the Argentine President Bartolomé Mitre and our protagonist, Pedro II of Brazil, invades Uruguay to overthrow Barro. After this, on December 13, 1864, Solano Lopez, who was an ally of Barro, invades Brazilian territory with the goal of passing into Uruguay and helping Barro. However, before he could do so, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, taken over by the Colorados, formed the so-called Triple Alliance against Paraguay. On May 1, 1865, and they quickly began military reprisals. The course of the war revealed Paraguay's military inability to defend itself against the Allies. They kept defeating it progressively and overwhelmingly in both land and naval battles between 1865 and 1868. On January 5, 1869, the Allies arrived in Asunción, the capital of Paraguay, a nation that, due to the ravages of war, was economically ruined and massively depopulated. After the Paraguayan capital was captured, Argentina and Uruguay withdrew from the conflict. However, the tenacious Empire of Brazil did not do the same. Solano Lopez, now more captive and disarmed, chooses to keep fleeing the Brazilians, heading further north in Paraguay. Nevertheless, during their raids, the Brazilians loot, destroy, and burn a large number of towns and villages. Many of them were left with only orphaned children and widowed mothers of the soldiers who were wiped out during the war. As they passed through Paraguay, the Brazilians order mass executions, rape hundreds of defenseless women, and set fire to hospitals and churches, many of these places with people inside. The War of the Triple Alliance lasts until the death of Solano Lopez, which takes place on March 1, 1870. After this, a provisional government in Asunción is recognized by the victors of the war, backed by Emperor Pedro II. They secure their geopolitical interests and significant territorial control over Paraguay, also becoming creditors of a major debt that will keep the Paraguayan nation economically subdued for several years. These acts of war show that the Empire of Brazil under Pedro II was, above all, a vigorous nation, aiming for full regional hegemony, and that it had no problem demonstrating this with such bloody victories and controversial acts as those committed during the War of the Triple Alliance. In this sense, and after the end of the War of the Triple Alliance in 1870, the Empire of Brazil reached its peak and experienced what has been called the Brazilian Golden Age, which lasted from 1870 to 1880. In the political sphere, this period, although characterized as the time of greatest stability during the reign of Pedro II. At the same time, internal tensions begin to arise that will eventually weaken the monarchical system. On one hand, growing conflicts arise with the church due to state intervention in ecclesiastical matters, which generates marked discontent among the Brazilian clergy. On the other hand, the army, strengthened and politicized after the War of the Triple Alliance, becomes increasingly autonomous and begins to sympathize with the Republican and positivist ideas of the time. In this sense, the so-called Republican movement emerges, especially in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. With the founding in 1873 of the Paulista Republican Party, which advocates a federalist model and greater provincial autonomy. On the other hand, in the economic sphere, Brazil experiences remarkable growth and modernization in all areas, establishing itself at that time as the largest and most dynamic economy in Latin America. The government implements a series of protectionist and tariff policies, raising import taxes to protect Brazilian manufacturing and stimulate local production. At the same time, tax incentives and subsidies are granted to emerging industries, especially in sectors such as metallurgy and textiles, eliminating tariffs on raw materials and machinery, facilitating productive modernization. In agriculture, a key sector of the Brazilian economy, the transition from slave labor to wage labor is promoted, promoting European immigration to meet the labor demand on coffee plantations, the main export product. At the same time, during this period, significant investments were made in infrastructure, such as railways and ports, largely financed with foreign loans, which allowed for improvements in transportation and trade. As a result, national production grew exponentially, going from 50,000 million reais in 1840 to 500,000 million in 1889. And the number of industrial establishments increased rapidly. However, wealth and development were mainly concentrated in the southern and southeastern regions of Brazil, while the northwest faced serious economic difficulties. Thank you for watching the video. Forget. On the other hand, regarding culture, in these years, Brazil began to develop what has been called a court society, with codes and rules of sociability that legitimize the functioning of the imperial state and the continuity of the ruling elite. Thus, manuals of good conduct such as the Von Tom Code are spread, establishing rules of behavior for the aristocracy and high society. The imperial court, which reserves all the political power of the nation for itself, becomes a microcosm, a center of culture and civilization, in the midst of a country that still faced serious problems in public education, health, and many other aspects. Furthermore, as we saw earlier, the influence of philosophical currents such as positivism grows especially among the military and intellectual sectors, promoting ideas of modernization, order, and progress. At the same time, education and the press are expanding, contributing to the formation of an increasingly critical and active public opinion. This drives debates about the monarchy and the need for profound political reforms. On the international stage, the 1870s is the time when events such as the victory in the War of the Triple Alliance and the successful diplomacy with powers like the United Kingdom consolidate Brazil's prestige at the regional and global level. Pedro II's Brazil is internationally perceived as a country with a stable political system, a constitutional monarchy in perfect condition, and an expanding economy. These were factors that attracted foreign capital and encouraged immigration, as we saw earlier. Aspects like building modern infrastructure, introducing technologies like the telephone, and improving postal services strengthen Brazil's cosmopolitan image of progress and modernity. However, the guarantor of that great international prestige that Brazil enjoys is Emperor Pedro II himself, who, with his enlightened profile and his progressive defense of the abolition of slavery, he also contributes to projecting an image of Brazil as a nation in transition toward more modern and civilized values. However, despite this great heyday that Brazil is experiencing, by the late 1870s and early 1880s, the empire begins to show signs of decline. The figure of Pedro II, although still popular, shows signs of exhaustion after 40 years of reign. His letters speak of a man increasingly fed up with the world and pessimistic about the future. Although meticulous in fulfilling his duties, he carried them out almost without enthusiasm, so much so that some historians label his growing indifference toward the fate of the regime and his lack of reaction to imperial opposition as the main, or perhaps the only, responsibility for the fall of the monarchy. Mainly, the absence of a male heir is a crucial factor that accelerates the weakening of Emperor Pedro II's empire. Although he loved his eldest daughter, Isabel, he considered that a woman in power was impractical in Brazil. And in addition to this, he holds the belief that the early death of his two sons was a sign that the empire was destined to disappear. The resistance to accepting a woman as head of state was shared by the rest of the ruling class. Since Brazil was at that time a very traditional country, which would only accept a male successor, Princess Isabel is also considered a very politically conservative woman, which makes her hardly tolerable for the liberal intellectuals who have been gaining ground since the 1870s. To all this was added the public rejection of Prince Consort Gaston d'Orléans, Count of Eu and husband of Isabel, who was known for being arrogant. He spoke with a French accent and charged exorbitant rents, which created fear that he would become the de facto emperor, pushing Isabel aside. Thus, combined with the absence of a male heir for Pedro II, multiple factors overlapped and led to the breakdown of the Brazilian imperial regime. One of them is that the political generation that had supported the regime since the 1830s, over time, it had been replaced by a new elite who had not lived through the initial moments of crisis of the empire, and as a result did not value the monarchy as a unifying force. This new political generation saw no reason to defend the imperial system, which further weakened institutional support. Thus, in this context, republicanism gained strength, especially among sectors of the army and the emerging urban middle class, which had arisen as a result of the economic progress of recent years. Economically, although Brazil maintained a growing and modernized economy, there were several structural problems toward the end of the empire. The main one was that the country depended heavily on foreign capital, mainly British and French, to finance its development, and this limited its economic autonomy and made it vulnerable to external crises, as happened on more than one occasion during these years. However, development and economic modernization were not uniform across the empire. While the South and Southeast prospered with agriculture, exports, and emerging industries, other regions, especially the Northeast, remained lagging and considerably behind, increasing social and regional tensions between the provinces and the imperial government. However, the hardest blow to the monarchy was the aforementioned abolition of slavery in 1888 through the Golden Law, which was actually signed by Princess Isabel and not by Pedro II. Slavery's abolition, seen as morally necessary by many and widely supported, occurred without financial compensation for the large slave owners who made up most of the economic and political base of the empire. This caused strong rejection and led to the loss of support from the slave-holding, land-owning elite for the monarchy. At the same time, the ranks of the army were made up of young officers educated in Republican and positivist ideas. They were increasingly dissatisfied with the imperial ruling class and demanded a greater political role. In addition, social and cultural movements began to emerge within the same society, questioning the pre-established imperial order, including demands for rights and political reforms. The combination of these social factors contributed to eroding the popular, military, and elite support for the monarchy. In this way, republicanism, perceived by the population as a synonym for social progress, began to gain ground in Brazil. Although the popularity of Emperor Pedro II was still great, his legitimacy had diminished, and the idea that there would not be a third reign after the death of Pedro II became increasingly common. Thus, the great edifice of the Empire of Brazil, erected over 66 years of political life, was about to experience its imminent collapse, which ended up happening sooner rather than later. In June 1889, the last ministerial cabinet of the empire was formed, headed by Visconde de Ouro Preto, and with the intention of implementing political reforms to save the monarchy, including greater provincial autonomy and freedom of voting. However, these reforms are rejected by the conservative majority in the General Chamber, which further complicates the position of the imperial government. Subsequently, during August of that same year, the cabinet began reorganizing the National Guard, creating a militia to rival the regular army. This measure generates growing tensions and discontent among the military, especially among those with Republican ideas who saw the National Guard as a threat to their influence. Thus, on November 9, 1889, several army officers, including Marshal Deodoro de Fonseca and Benjamin Constant, meet to plan a coup d'etat against the monarchy. Then, on November 13, Republican civilians and military officers draft the plan for the coup at the house of the politician Rui Barbosa. Although Deodoro de Fonseca prefers that the action be led exclusively by the military. Thus, with the fate of the empire sealed, on the morning of November 15, a group of military officers led by da Fonseca carry out a coup d'etat without resorting to violence. In Rio de Janeiro, they deposed Emperor Pedro II and the Prime Minister, Visconde de Ouro Preto. After this, in the municipal chamber of Rio de Janeiro, the Republic is solemnly proclaimed and da Fonseca is declared president of the provisional government. On November 15th, José do Patrocínio drafts the official proclamation of the Republic of the United States of Brazil, approved without a vote and announced publicly. The next day, November 16th, Pedro II, who was in Petrópolis, returns to Rio de Janeiro, thinking that the aim of the plot was only to replace the cabinet of Visconde de Ouro Preto and not to end the imperial regime. Thus, Pedro II tries to organize another ministerial cabinet, but a rumor that he had chosen the politician Gasparda Silveira Martins a staunch enemy of Deodoro da Fonseca, as the new prime minister, convinces Deodoro to join the Republican cause. Disappointed and unable to do anything, Pedro II decides to surrender to the coup leaders without offering any resistance. That same day, November 16, Major Frederico Solon de Sampaio Ribeiro delivers to Pedro II the order to leave for Europe to avoid political disturbances. Thus, the Brazilian imperial family goes into exile in Europe and is not allowed to return to Brazil until the 1920s. In this way, the long history of the only South American monarchy of its time had come to an end, after 67 uninterrupted years of remarkable existence. These years have not gone unnoticed by historians from all over the world, who have described the Brazilian monarchical experience as an example of extraordinary political, economic, social, and institutional virtues. The Empire of Brazil, despite its abrupt end, left a complex and lasting legacy that has shaped the identity of the Brazilian nation to this day. The deposition of Pedro II, a monarch greatly loved by the majority of the people, was a unique event. His reign was followed by a period of weak governments, dictatorships, and constitutional and economic crises that would last well into the 20th century. However, the very men who exiled him eventually turned him into a hero for the Brazilian Republic. The last years of Pedro II in exile were lonely and melancholic, living with scarce resources in modest hotels and writing in his diary about his dreams of returning to Brazil. His wife, Teresa Cristina, passed away a few days after arriving in Europe in November 1889. For his part, Pedro II died in Paris on December 5, 1891 at the age of 66 due to pneumonia. His last words, as far as we know, were, "May God grant me these last wishes of peace and prosperity for Brazil." After the death of Pedro II, the Brazilian Republican government, fearing the impact his death might have, refused to make any official statements. However, the Brazilian people did not remain indifferent, as there were expressions of grief throughout Brazil. Throughout December 1891, the country witnessed numerous businesses closing. Flags flown at half-mast, mourning bells, and religious ceremonies were held to pay tribute to Emperor Pedro II and the monarchical regime he represented. This was the last notable popular demonstration in favor of the emperor and the imperial regime. Their presence in Brazil and South America's historical channels still sparks major controversy between those who take a stand in favor of an empire like Brazil's and those who side with presidential republics like the Hispanic American ones. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave us a like, subscribe, activate the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos, and share it with your friends through social networks like WhatsApp or Facebook. This way you help us a lot to reach new people and keep producing this material. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart for following and supporting us, and we'll see you next time.